Cadet Lee Hanna stepped off the transport shuttle and immediately felt every eye in the docking bay turn toward her. The massive doors of Nexus Prime Military Academy stretched high above her head, gleaming silver under the artificial lights. She had dreamed of this moment for years, but now that she was here, she felt incredibly small. The other new cadets towered around her like walking mountains. A group of Krillians stood near the entrance, their thick red skin covered in natural armor plates that look harder than steel. Each one was at least 3 meters tall with arms as thick as tree trunks. Their deep voices rumbled as they talked among themselves, making the metal floor vibrate under Hannah's feet. "Look at that tiny thing," one of them said, pointing a massive finger in her direction. "Is that supposed to be a warrior?" Near the information boards, a cluster of Viridians moved with liquid grace. Their blue-silver skin shimmered as they darted from place to place with incredible speed. Even when they were standing still, they seemed to vibrate with barely contained energy. Their sharp claws caught the light as they gestured, and Hannah noticed how they could move so fast they looked like blurs. "The first human ever accepted here," whispered one Viridian to another, but her enhanced hearing picked up every word. "I heard they barely meet the minimum physical requirements." The Thoraxians were perhaps the most impressive of all. These massive beings looked like walking tanks, their shell-like bodies providing natural armor that could probably stop a plasma blast. When they moved, the ground shook slightly. One of them was easily 4 times Hannah's size, with claws that could crush metal. Commander Veltar, a battle-scarred Krillian with silver streaks running through his red armor plating, stepped forward to address the new arrivals. His voice boomed across the docking bay, without any need for amplification. "Welcome to Nexus Prime Military Academy," he announced, his yellow eyes scanning the group before settling on Hannah. "For 300 years, this academy has trained the galaxy's finest warriors. We have produced generals, fleet commanders, and heroes whose names are spoken with respect across 1,000 worlds." The commander's gaze lingered on Hannah for what felt like an eternity. "This year, we have our first human cadet, Cadet Lee Hanna from planet Earth." His tone made it clear he was not impressed. "We shall see if your species possesses any qualities worthy of this institution." Laughter erupted from the assembled cadets. The Krillians' deep chuckles mixed with the Viridians' high-pitched chittering and the Thoraxians' rumbling amusement. The sound echoed off the metal walls and seemed to go on forever. Hannah kept her face calm, but her hands clenched into fists at her sides. She had expected this reaction. Every report about other species described humans as weak, slow, and poorly designed for combat. They had no natural weapons, no armor, no special abilities that made them obviously dangerous. "Your quarters have been assigned," Commander Veltar continued. "Training begins at dawn. I suggest you all get adequate rest. Tomorrow, we begin separating the true warriors from pretenders." As the group dispersed, Hannah found herself walking alone toward the residential sector. The corridors of Nexus Prime were built for beings much larger than humans. The ceilings stretched high overhead, and she had to take quick steps to keep up with the longer strides of her fellow cadets. "Excuse me," called a voice behind her. Hannah turned to see a maintenance droid hovering nearby. "Cadet Lee Hanna, I am to escort you to your quarters." The droid led her through a maze of corridors past the standard cadet rooms. Other new arrivals were settling into spacious chambers designed for their various species' needs. Finally, they stopped at a much smaller door near the service areas. These quarters were originally designed for maintenance staff. The droid explained with what might have been embarrassment in his mechanical voice. They were the only space available that meets human size requirements. Hannah's room was barely large enough for a bed, a small desk, and a storage unit. Through the thin walls, she could hear the conversations of her neighbors, including more comments about the pet human the Academy had decided to accept. As she unpacked her few belongings, Hannah thought about the long journey that had brought her here. Earth's military leaders had fought for years to get even one human accepted into the Academy. They needed to prove that humans belonged among the galaxy's warrior races. Looking out her small window at the stars beyond, Hannah made a silent promise. She would show them all that being small did not mean being weak. She would prove that humans had something the other species lacked, even if she was not yet sure what that something was. The laughter from the docking bay still echoed in her memory. But Hannah had learned something important from Earth's history. Sometimes the most dangerous opponents were the ones everyone underestimated. Tomorrow, her real test would begin. The alarm screamed through the academy halls at 4 a.m, jolting Hannah from her restless sleep. She stumbled out of bed, quickly pulling on her training uniform as heavy footsteps thundered past her door. The other cadets were already moving toward the training grounds with the confidence of beings born for war. Hannah rushed to catch up, her shorter legs working twice as hard to match their pace. The main training hall was enormous, filled with obstacle courses that looked more like torture devices and exercise equipment. Massive walls stretched toward the ceiling, rope climbs that seemed to go on forever, and metal beams that would challenge even the strongest beings. Physical conditioning begins now, barked Instructor Kixval, a thin Viridian whose movements were so fast he appeared to flicker. You have 30 minutes to complete the basic course. Anyone who fails will scrub floors for a week. The Krillian cadets attacked the obstacles with brute force, smashing through barriers that would stop most beings. Their thick arms pulled them up rope climbs like they weighed nothing. Hannah watched in amazement as Cadet Thokmar, her massive roommate, literally punched holes through walls that were supposed to be climbed over. The Viridians moved like liquid lightning, flowing around obstacles faster than the eye could follow. They seemed to barely touch the ground as they leaped from platform to platform, their natural speed making the course look easy. Hannah approached the first wall, a smooth metal barrier twice her height. She jumped, her fingers barely catching the top edge. Her arms burned as she struggled to pull herself up, while around her the alien cadets were already finishing the entire course. "Come on, human," called out one of the Thoraxians with amusement. "My grandmother could climb faster than that, and she has been dead for 50 years. Laughter echoed through the training hall as Hannah finally hauled herself over the wall, only to face the rope climb. Her hands were already shaking from exhaustion, and she was not even halfway through the course. The thick rope felt impossibly heavy as she pulled herself up inch by painful inch. By the time she completed the basic course, every other cadet had finished and was already moving on to advanced exercises. Hannah collapsed on the floor, gasping for air, her muscles screaming in protest. "Pathetic," muttered Instructor Kixval as he marked something on his electronic pad. "Perhaps you should consider requesting transfer to the kitchen staff, Cadet Lee." The afternoon brought hand-to-hand combat training, and Hannah's heart sank as she entered the combat arena. The floor was covered with thick mats, but she knew they would not cushion the beating she was about to receive. "Pair up for sparring exercises," commanded Combat Instructor Mordak, a scarred Thoraxian whose shell showed the marks of countless battles. "Remember, this is training, not a death match. Try not to permanently damage your partners." Hannah found herself facing Cadet Zeklon, a Viridian whose blue-silver skin seemed to shimmer with contained energy. He was not the largest opponent she could have drawn, but his speed made him possibly the most dangerous. "I will try to go easy on you, little human," Zeklon said with what might have been kindness. "Just try not to embarrass yourself too badly." The sparring match lasted exactly 12 seconds. Zeklon moved so fast that Hannah barely saw him come before she found herself flat on her back, staring at the ceiling. The impact knocked the wind from her lungs, and spots danced in front of her eyes. "Again!" called Instructor Mordak. The second match lasted 8 seconds. The third lasted 5. Each time, Hannah picked herself up from the mat, while the watching cadets snickered and made jokes about human fragility. "At least she keeps getting back up," observed one Krillian cadet to another. "Most species would have given up by now." "Stupid is not the same as brave," his companion replied with a rumbling laugh. Evening meal was served in the great dining hall, where cadets sat with their own species at tables sized to their different needs. Hannah sat alone at a human-sized table, picking at food that had been specially prepared for her biology. Around her, the alien cadets discussed the day's training with easy confidence. "Did you see the human try and climb the wall today?" asked a Viridian at a nearby table. "I thought she might actually fall and hurt herself." "The instructors are being too kind," replied a Thoraxian. "In real combat, the enemy will not wait for her to catch up." As Hannah walked back to her quarters, she passed the Academy's honor wall, where the portraits of legendary graduates looked down with stern expressions. Every face belonged to a different alien species. Warriors who had conquered worlds, admirals who had commanded great fleets, heroes whose names were known across the galaxy. Not one human face looked back at her. In her small room, Hannah sat on her bed and examined her bruised hands. Every muscle in her body ached, and she knew tomorrow would bring more of the same. The other cadets were right about one thing. She was failing at almost everything the Academy demanded. But as she prepared for sleep, Hannah thought about something her father had told her before she left Earth. Humans had not conquered their home world through strength or speed. They had done it through something else, something that was harder to measure, but just as powerful. She just had to figure out what that something was before the Academy decided she did not belong there at all. 3 weeks into the Academy program, Hannah had learned to expect failure. Her physical scores remained at the bottom of every ranking, and the medical base staff knew her by name from all her visits after combat training. The other cadets had stopped openly mocking her and now simply ignored her presence, which somehow felt worse than the laughter. Everything changed during advanced tactical studies class. Professor Kexran, an ancient Thoraxian whose shell bore scars from a dozen wars, presented the day's challenge on a massive holographic display. The three-dimensional battlefield showed a complex scenario that had stumped military strategists for generations. The hostage crisis of Vega Station, he announced, his voice carrying the weight of history. 47 previous cadet classes have attempted the simulation. The best solution achieved a 70% survival rate with mission completion time of 4 hours and 23 minutes. The holographic display showed a space station under siege. Terrorist forces had taken control of 3 critical sections, holding over 200 civilian hostages. The station's life support systems were failing, escape routes were blocked, and any direct assault would result in massive casualties. Cadet Grixtal, the largest Araxian in their class, volunteered to go first. His massive form cast shadows across the hologram as he studied the layout with the calculating mind of a born warrior. Overwhelming force applied to the weakest structural points, he declared confidently. Breach the outer hull here, here, and here. Storm each section simultaneously before the terrorists can react. The simulation ran quickly, showing armored troops smashing through the station's walls like paper. But the terrorist response was immediate and devastating. Hostages died in crossfire, explosions tore through critical systems, and the mission ended in disaster. 55% casualties, Professor Kexran noted with disappointment. Mission failure. Cadet Zephyra stepped forward next, her Viridian form moving with liquid grace as she analyzed the scenario. Her approach focused on speed and precision, using lightning-fast infiltration teams to neutralize threats before they could respond. Surgical strikes through ventilation systems, she explained, her hands moving in complex patterns as she outlined her strategy. Hit all 3 sections within 30 seconds of each other. The simulation showed her plan in action. Viridian troops moved like ghosts through the station's hidden passages, appearing behind enemy lines with deadly efficiency. But the terrorists had prepared for such tactics, and hidden sensors trigger explosive traps that kill both attackers and hostages. 62% casualties, the professor announced. Mission failure. Several more cadets tried their approaches. The Krillians favored direct assault variations, while other Viridians attempted different infiltration strategies. Each simulation ended in failure, some worse than others, but none achieving an acceptable outcome. Finally, Professor Kexran's gaze fell on Hannah, who had been sitting quietly in the back row, her dark eyes fixed on the holographic display with unusual intensity. "Cadet Lee," he said with barely concealed skepticism, "would you care to attempt what 3 centuries of superior military minds have failed to achieve?" The other cadets turned to look at her, some with amusement, others with curiosity. Hannah stood slowly and walked to the front of the classroom, her small form dwarfed by the massive holographic station. For several minutes, she said nothing. Her eyes traced pathways through the 3-dimensional maze, noting details that others had overlooked. She studied the terrorist positions, the hostage locations, the failing life support systems, and the station's structural layout. "The problem is not the terrorists," she said finally, her voice quiet but clear. The problem is that everyone tries to fight them. Professor Kexran's ancient eyes narrowed. Explain. Hannah moved the control interface, her fingers dancing across the complex controls with surprising skill. The holographic display shifted, highlighting systems and connections that previous cadets had ignored. The terrorists want to be fought, she continued, manipulating the display to show communication networks and power distribution systems. They expect assault forces, infiltration teams, and rescue attempts. They are prepared for all of those responses. The hologram changed again, showing the station's environmental controls, emergency broadcast systems, and internal security networks. But they have not prepared for this, Hannah said. Her strategy unfolded like a masterpiece of misdirection and psychological warfare. Instead of attacking the terrorists directly, she turned the station itself into a weapon. She rerouted power to create the illusion of system failures in sections the terrorists controlled. She used the internal communication system to plant false information that made the terrorist groups suspicious of each other. Most brilliantly, she activated the station's emergency evacuation protocols in a sequence that forced the terrorists to move hostages to what they thought were safer locations. But Hannah had calculated their movements perfectly, using their own paranoia to herd both terrorists and hostages into areas where rescue teams could extract the civilians while confused enemy forces fought shadows. The simulation ran in fast-forward, showing terrorist groups turning on each other, hostages being evacuated through routes the enemy never suspected, an entire crisis resolving without a single shot being fired by the rescue forces. Mission completion time, 47 minutes. Professor Kexran announced, his voice filled with amazement. Casualty rate, 0%. Complete silence filled the classroom. The other cadets stared at the holographic display, then at Hannah, then back at the display as if they could not believe what they had just witnessed. Fascinating, Professor Kexran murmured, his scarred features showing something approaching respect. You did not fight the scenario's constraints, Cadet Lee. You redesigned the entire battlefield to your advantage. As word of Hannah's achievement spread through the academy, the whispers changed. No longer did they speak of the weak human who could not climb walls or win fights. Now they wondered what other surprises the small cadet might have hidden beneath her unassuming appearance. The final combat assessment arrived with all the ceremony and terror that 3 centuries of tradition demanded. The entire academy gathered in the massive observation arena, tier upon tier seats filled with instructors, visiting military officials, and cadets who had already completed their trials. At the center sat the ultimate combat chamber, a spherical room that could simulate any battlefield condition imaginable. Hannah stood at the entrance with the other final-year cadets, her small frame looking impossibly fragile next to the towering warriors around her. Her hands were steady, but her heart hammered against her ribs. Everything she had worked for over the past months came down to the next few hours. Commander Veltar's voice boomed across the arena through the speaker system. The ultimate combat assessment tests every skill a warrior must possess. Physical combat, tactical thinking, leadership under pressure, and the ability to adapt when everything goes wrong. The first challenge was individual combat against the Academy's top cadets. Hannah watched through the viewing screens as massive Krillians battled with earth-shaking force, their natural armor deflecting blows that would kill lesser beings. Viridians moved like deadly shadows, their speed creating afterimages as they struck with precision that seemed impossible. When Hannah's name was called, the murmur of conversation in the arena died to complete silence. She walked into the combat chamber to face Cadet Thakmar, her former roommate, whose massive form filled nearly a quarter of the space. "I will try not to hurt you too badly, little friend," Thakmar rumbled with genuine kindness. Despite their size difference, months of living together had created an odd friendship between them. The simulation began with both fighters placed in a ruined cityscape filled with debris, broken buildings, and scattered equipment. Thakmar charged immediately, his powerful legs shaking the ground with each step. His strategy was simple and effective. Use overwhelming force and the fight quickly. But Hannah was no longer the confused cadet who had arrived months earlier. She rolled aside at the last second, letting Thakmar's momentum carry him past her into a pile of rubble. Before he could turn around, she had grabbed a piece of broken metal pipe and wedged it between the plates of his natural armor. "What are you doing?" Thakmar asked, more curious than concerned. Instead of answering, Hannah kicked a support beam that sent a cascade of concrete blocks tumbling down. Thakmar instinctively raised his arms to protect his head, and in that moment of distraction, Hannah used a metal pipe as a lever to flip him onto his back like an overturned turtle. The massive Krillian struggled to right himself, but his own weight and armor worked against him. Hannah had not defeated him through strength. She had used his size and natural instincts as weapons against him. "Combat complete," announced the computer. "Winner, Cadet Lee Hannah." The arena erupted in shocked whispers. No one had expected the human to win, least of all in such an unconventional way. Her next opponent was Zephyra, the lightning-fast Viridian who had been undefeated in every previous combat exercise. The simulation placed him in a maze of narrow corridors where speed should have been the ultimate advantage. Zephyra moved like liquid mercury, appearing and disappearing so quickly that she seemed to be in multiple places at once. Her claws whistled through the air where Hannah had been standing just moments before. But Hannah had studied her opponent carefully. She began dropping small objects in specific locations, pieces of debris, broken glass, anything that would make noise when stepped on. Then she started moving in patterns that forced Zephyra to follow predictable paths. The Viridian's incredible speed became her weakness as she found herself running into traps Hannah had prepared. Each corridor led to another obstacle. Each turn forced her into spaces where her movements became limited and predictable. Finally, Hannah used the maze itself as a weapon, triggering a collapse that blocked all exits except one. A narrow passage where speed meant nothing and only patience and careful movement would work. "I do not understand," Zephyra said as she admitted defeat. "How did you know where I would be?" "You are very fast," Hannah replied simply, "but you are also very predictable." The final phase was a command simulation, where Hannah found herself in control of a battle fleet facing impossible odds. Enemy forces outnumbered her 3-1. Her ships were outgunned, and conventional tactics would result in total defeat. The observation arena fell silent as Hannah studied the tactical display. Watching instructors expected her to attempt some variation of standard fleet maneuvers. Instead, she did something that made several professors gasp in amazement. She began broadcasting on all frequencies, not to her own forces, but to the enemy fleet. Her messages were carefully crafted to create confusion and suspicion between different enemy commanders. She fed them false information about secret weapons and hidden reinforcements. Most importantly, she made each enemy group believe that the others were planning to betray them. The enemy fleet began to fragment as commanders turned suspicious of their allies. Ships that should have been working together started positioning themselves defensively against each other. The overwhelming numerical advantage dissolved into chaos as the enemy forces fought among themselves. When the simulation ended, Hannah's fleet had won a complete victory without firing a single shot at the actual enemy. She had turned their own size and complexity into weapons against them. The arena remained completely silent for several heartbeats. Then Commander Veltar spoke, his voice filled with something that might have been awe. "Final assessment scores for Cadet Lee Hannah," he announced. "Combat efficiency rating, beyond maximum scale. Strategic innovation, unprecedented. Adaptability index, immeasurable." The silence exploded into noise as the impossible became reality. The small human had not just passed the ultimate combat assessment. She had redefined what was possible. The news of Hannah's unprecedented test scores spread through the galaxy like wildfire. Within hours of the ultimate combat assessment, military commanders from every major world were sending urgent messages to Nexus Prime Academy. The communication arrays worked overtime as reports, analyses, and requests flooded in from across known space. Commander Veltar stood in his office, staring at a wall covered with data screens showing Hannah's performance metrics. The numbers still seemed impossible, even after watching the test with his own eyes. His scarred features showed confusion, mixed with something approaching wonder. "Sir," called his aide, a young Viridian officer whose usual speed seemed subdued by shock. "High Command is requesting an immediate full report on the human cadet. They want to know if the test results are accurate." "They are accurate," Veltar replied slowly. I have checked them 17 times. Professor Kexran entered the office carrying an armload of historical records and analysis reports. His ancient shell showed signs of wear from a sleepless night spent researching and calculating. Commander, I have reviewed 3 centuries of Academy records, the old Thoraxian announced. No cadet in our history has achieved scores like these. Her combat efficiency ratings broke our measurement systems. We literally did not have numbers high enough to properly score her performance. The door chimed again, and Instructor Kixval flickered into the room with typical Viridian speed. But even his movements seemed less confident than usual. The other cadets are asking questions, he reported. They want to understand how a being they considered weak achieved what none of them could accomplish. Some are requesting to study human combat techniques. Word reached the Academy's most distinguished graduates within days. Admiral Korthax, a legendary Krillian fleet commander who had never lost a battle, arrived personally to review the test recordings. His massive form barely fit in the observation room as he watched Hannah's performances over and over. This changes everything we thought we knew about warfare, he said finally, his deep voice filled with amazement. She did not fight her opponents. She made them fight themselves. Dr. Yilvan, the galaxy's leading expert on military psychology, traveled from the core worlds to study the phenomenon. Her multiple Zenthri eyes blinked in sequence as she analyzed the data, her tentacles moving rapidly across holographic displays. Fascinating adaptation patterns, she murmured to herself. The human brain appears to process tactical information in ways we have never encountered. Where other species see obstacles, she sees opportunities. Where they see enemies, she sees puzzles to be solved. The Academy's library became Hannah's second home as researchers from across the galaxy arrived to study human military history. They discovered records of Earth's ancient warriors who had conquered their world not through superior strength or speed, but through intelligence, persistence, and the ability to adapt to any situation. Look at this, Professor Kexran said excitedly, displaying historical records for a group of visiting military experts. Human armies regularly defeated opponents who were larger, stronger, and better equipped. They specialized in turning their enemies' advantages into weaknesses. The implications became clear as the analysis continued. Humans had evolved differently from every other known species. While others developed natural weapons, armor, or enhanced physical abilities, humans had developed something far more dangerous: the ability to think their way out of any situation. Commander Veltar called an assembly of the entire Academy to address the growing interest in human capabilities. Cadets, instructors, and visiting officials packed the Great Hall as he stood at the podium with Hannah beside him. For 3 centuries, this Academy has trained warriors based on a simple principle, he announced, his voice carrying to every corner of the vast space. We believe that strength, speed, and natural weapons were the foundations of military excellence. He gestured to Hannah, whose small form looked impossibly tiny on the massive stage designed for much larger beings. Cadetly has shown us our error. Humans did not evolve as apex predators like our species. They evolved as persistence hunters and toolmakers. Every apparent weakness, their size, lack of natural weapons, seeming fragility, actually contributed to developing the most dangerous military minds in known space. The audience murmured as the full meaning became clear. The galaxy's military establishments had spent millennia focusing on the wrong qualities entirely. Dr. Yilvan took the stage next, her research data displayed on screens throughout the hall. Humans do not need claws when they can turn any object into a weapon, she explained, her multiple voices creating harmonious echoes. They do not need armor when they can reshape entire battlefields to their advantage. They do not need natural speed when they can predict and counter every opponent's moves before those moves are made. Within weeks of Hannah's graduation ceremony, every major military force in the galaxy was desperately trying to recruit human tactical advisors. Fleet commands that had existed for centuries suddenly realized they had been fighting wars the hard way. Elite units that prided themselves on physical superiority discovered they needed strategic minds more than strong bodies. The Galactic Military Council issued new doctrine guidelines based entirely on principles that humans have been using for thousands of years. Ancient Earth concepts like guerrilla warfare, psychological operations, and adaptive tactics became required study for officers across known space. Hannah stood in her new quarters aboard the flagship of the Fifth Fleet, wearing the uniform of a tactical advisor with rank insignia that had been created specifically for human officers. Through her window, she could see other ships in the fleet, each now carrying its own human strategic specialist. The laughter from her first day at the academy seemed like a memory from another lifetime. Now, when alien warriors looked at humans, they saw something that made them deeply uncomfortable, an opponent they could not predict, could not outfight through conventional means, and could not defeat by being bigger, stronger, or faster. The galaxy had learned a new lesson that would reshape military thinking forever. Never underestimate the species that conquer their own world not through natural gifts, but through the simple refusal to accept that any problem could not be solved.